6 young soldiers stood shivering in a circle, fumbling with equipment worth more than most people's cars, and not a single one of them could produce a flame. Rain hammered the mountainside like it had a personal grudge against every living thing caught on that ridge. The squad leader cracked open another waterproof flare canister, struck the igniter 3 times, watched the tip hiss and die, and threw it into the mud with a curse that echoed off the tree line. Behind them, half hidden under a canvas poncho that looked older than most of their fathers, a 79-year-old man with deep-set eyes and hands like weathered rope quietly unlaced his left boot. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed him until it was too late to pretend they hadn't needed him all along. If you believe the people who came before us still have something to teach, comment the word signal right now and stay with me. Because what this man did next with nothing but a bootlace and a jacket saved 6 lives and silenced every voice that had spent the weekend laughing at him behind his back. His name was Arthur Beckett. Most people who met him in his daily life knew him only as the quiet old man who sat on the same bench outside the Elks Lodge in Brainerd, Minnesota, every morning at 7:15 with a thermos of black coffee and a paperback Western novel so worn the spine had been taped twice. He walked with a slight forward lean, not quite a stoop, but the kind of posture that suggested decades of carrying weight most people couldn't imagine. His face was a landscape of deep furrows and sun damage, his jaw set in a permanent expression that could be mistaken for stubbornness or sadness depending on the light. He wore the same rotation of flannel shirts and canvas work pants he'd been wearing since the early 1980s, and the only concession he made to the modern world was a pair of thick-soled orthopedic boots his daughter had bought him 3 Christmases ago that he wore every single day without complaint. Arthur didn't talk about himself. If someone asked what he'd done for a living, he would say he'd worked at the paper mill, which was true. If someone asked if he'd served, he would give a single nod and change the subject, which told you everything and nothing at the same time. He had a Purple Heart in a cigar box in his closet. He had a Bronze Star in the same box. He had a set of dog tags so worn the stamping was almost illegible hanging from a nail behind his bedroom door, and he had not voluntarily spoken about career in over 50 years. The survival training exercise had not been Arthur's idea. It had been his grandson's. Staff Sergeant Tyler Beckett, 27 years old, assigned to a National Guard unit out of Camp Ripley, had been organising a weekend field exercise in the Chippewa National Forest for his squad. The premise was straightforward. 6 soldiers would be inserted into a remote section of the forest with limited supplies and tasked with navigating to an extraction point 18 miles away over 3 days, practicing land navigation, shelter construction, water procurement, and emergency signalling along the way. Tyler had mentioned it over Sunday dinner at his grandfather's house 3 weeks earlier, and Arthur had listened quietly while spooning gravy over mashed potatoes, his expression unreadable. Tyler's mother, Arthur's daughter, Karen, had said something about how it sounded dangerous, and Tyler had laughed and told her it was just training, and Arthur had set his fork down and said 4 words that surprised everyone at the table. "I'd like to come." Tyler had blinked. Karen had opened her mouth to object. Arthur had looked at his grandson with those deep-set eyes and said he wouldn't be any trouble, that he just wanted to see the forest again, that he hadn't been out in real woods in years, and his doctor said walking was good for him. Tyler, who loved his grandfather fiercely and who had grown up hearing fragments of stories about career from his mother that Arthur himself had never confirmed or denied, had said yes before he could think of a reason to say no. The squad had assembled at the trailhead on a Friday morning in late October. The weather forecast had called for partly cloudy skies with a chance of light rain on Saturday, which in northern Minnesota in autumn meant precisely nothing because the weather did whatever it wanted. Tyler introduced his grandfather to the 5 other soldiers as a Korean War veteran who wanted to tag along, and the reactions ranged from polite handshakes to barely concealed amusement. Specialist Rivera, 23, who had done 2 rotations in a desert environment and considered himself the squad's unofficial survivalist, had looked Arthur up and down and then looked at Tyler with an expression that clearly said "you're joking." Private First Class Dawson, 21, the youngest of the group, had at least been courteous, shaking Arthur's hand and asking which unit he'd served with, but Arthur had just said infantry and left it at that. Corporal Haynes, 25, who was responsible for the squad's communication and signalling equipment, had asked Tyler privately if the old man was going to slow them down, and Tyler had told him his grandfather could handle it and to drop it. Specialist Park and Private Torres, both 24, had exchanged a look and said nothing, which in its own way said everything. Arthur shouldered a small pack that he'd put together himself, lighter than anyone else's but packed with a precision none of them noticed, and they set off into the forest. The first day went well enough. Arthur kept pace without complaint, walking with that steady forward lean, his boots finding solid ground with an instinct that seemed almost unconscious. He didn't talk much. He watched the squad navigate with their GPS units and topographic maps, and said nothing when Rivera led them 300 meters off course and had to backtrack. He said nothing when Dawson struggled to set up his shelter, half, and ended up sleeping under a configuration that would have collapsed in any wind above 5 miles per hour. He said nothing when Haynes tested the emergency signaling equipment and declared everything operational with a confidence that assumed the weather would cooperate. Arthur built his own shelter in 12 minutes using a poncho, 2 lengths of paracord and a fallen birch limb, and when Torres walked by and glanced at it, he said it looked like something out of a history book, and Arthur just nodded and crawled inside and went to sleep. That night the temperature dropped to 34 degrees, and a light rain began to fall, and by morning every soldier except Arthur woke up damp, stiff, and irritable. Arthur emerged from his shelter dry, folded his poncho with military precision, and sat on a rock eating a strip of beef jerky while the others cursed and wrung out their gear. Rivera muttered something about beginner's luck. Arthur heard him and said nothing. The second day is when things went wrong. The light rain that had started overnight didn't stop. It got worse. By noon, the sky had turned the colour of a deep bruise, and what had been a steady drizzle became a hammering downpour that reduced visibility to less than 50 metres and turned every trail into a running stream of mud and debris. The temperature dropped further, hovering just above freezing, and the wind picked up from the northwest, driving the rain sideways through the trees with a sound like continuous static. Tyler checked the weather on the satellite communicator and his face went tight. A system that hadn't been in the forecast had moved in fast and it wasn't moving out. They were looking at 12 to 18 hours of sustained heavy rain, dropping temperatures and wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour. He gathered the squad and told them the situation. They were 9 miles from the extraction point, on a ridge above a river valley that was likely already flooding, and the smart play was to shelter in place, signal for early extraction, and get picked up by helicopter rather than risk a river crossing in deteriorating conditions. Everyone agreed. The mood shifted from training exercise to something more serious, and for the first time Arthur saw the young soldiers stop treating the weekend as a game. Haynes unpacked the signalling equipment with the efficiency of someone who had done it 100 times in a classroom, and never once in a genuine emergency. The squad carried 3 types of modern pyrotechnics signalling devices. They had pen flares, compact launchers that fired a bright magnesium charge to an altitude of approximately 200 feet. They had smoke signal canisters designed to produce dense orange smoke, visible from the air for up to 90 seconds. And they had handheld signal flares, magnesium-based sticks that burned at extreme temperatures and were rated waterproof to a depth of 1 meter. Haynes also had a strobe light and the satellite communicator, which could send a distress signal with GPS coordinates. Tyler activated the satellite communicator and sent the distress call. The response came back in 4 minutes. A helicopter was available, but wouldn't launch until they had a visual confirmation of the squad's exact position on the ridge because the weather was creating dangerous conditions for low-altitude flight, and the pilot needed a ground reference point to approach safely. They needed to put up a visible signal. Haynes said no problem. He was wrong. The first pen flare misfired. Haynes loaded the cartridge, aimed skyward, pulled the trigger, and the igniter sparked, but the propellant charge, saturated despite its supposedly waterproof casing, produced a wet pop and a puff of acrid smoke that went nowhere. He tried a second one. Same result. The third pen flare launched, but the magnesium charge failed to ignite at altitude, and the cartridge arced into the rain like a spent bullet casing and disappeared into the trees below the ridge. Rivera opened the smoke signal canisters. The first one ignited, but the dense rain and wind shredded the orange smoke before it could rise more than 10 feet, dispersing it into nothing in seconds. The second canister's pull ring mechanism jammed, corroded by moisture that had somehow gotten past the seal. The third produced a brief, pathetic wisp of colour that the wind tore apart like tissue paper. Haynes moved to the handheld flares, the last resort, the ones rated waterproof, the ones that were supposed to work in any conditions. He struck the first one. It sparked. It caught. It burned for exactly 4 seconds before the sustained rain, driven horizontally by the wind directly into the flame, overwhelmed the chemical reaction and killed it. He struck the second one with hands that were starting to shake from cold and frustration. It didn't ignite at all. The striking surface was too wet, the friction insufficient, the physics indifferent to his increasingly desperate attempts. He tried the third, nothing. The fourth, a spark, a brief hiss, nothing. He threw the dead flare into the mud and stood there with his hands at his sides and his jaw clenched and rain streaming down his face. And for the first time in the exercise, he looked genuinely afraid. Tyler got back on the satellite communicator. He told the helicopter crew they couldn't get a visual signal up. The pilot's voice came back through the static, calm but firm. Without a visual reference point, he couldn't safely descend below the cloud ceiling to locate them on the ridge. The GPS coordinates put them in a general area, but the ridge had multiple clearings, and the pilot needed to see exactly where they were to make an approach in this weather. He could orbit at altitude and wait, but he couldn't wait forever because fuel was a factor, and the weather was getting worse, not better. If they couldn't produce a ground signal within the next 60 to 90 minutes, the helicopter would have to return to base and they'd have to shelter in place until the storm passed, which could be another 12 hours or more. 12 hours in dropping temperatures, soaking wet with inadequate shelter, at elevation, in conditions that were textbook hypothermia territory. Tyler looked at his squad. Rivera was trying to get one of the dead flares to relight by sheltering it under his body armor. Dawson was shivering visibly. Park and Torres were huddled together under a poncho that the wind kept ripping away from them. Haynes was staring at the pile of failed signaling equipment with the expression of a man watching his professional competence dissolve in the rain. Nobody was looking at Arthur. Arthur had been standing slightly apart from the group for the last 20 minutes, near the edge of the tree line where the ridge clearing met the forest. He had been watching everything. He had watched Haynes struggle with the flares. He had watched the smoke signals die. He had watched his grandson's face tighten with a worry that Tyler was trying very hard not to let his soldiers see. And something had shifted behind those deep-set eyes, some mechanism that had been dormant for decades clicking into place with the quiet precision of a rifle bolt sliding home. Arthur sat down on a wet rock, pulled his left boot off, and began unlacing it. The bootlace was made of woven nylon, standard issue from the orthopedic boot manufacturer, approximately 40 inches long. He unlaced the right boot as well and tied the 2 laces together, then reached into the small pack he'd been carrying and withdrew 3 items. A Ziploc bag containing a handful of dryer lint he had collected from the lint trap in his laundry room before leaving home, a short length of jute twine, about 18 inches that he had wrapped around a pencil stub, and a ferro rod, an old one, scratched and worn, the kind that hadn't been standard military issue in over 40 years. Rivera noticed first. He saw the old man sitting on a rock in the pouring rain, bootless, working with his hands, and he walked over with the kind of expression people reserve for watching someone do something they think is pointless. "What are you doing?" he asked, and his voice carried the same dismissive edge it had carried since the trailhead. Arthur didn't look up. He was separating the fibres of the jute twine, pulling them apart into a loose bundle of thin filaments that he arranged in a bird's nest shape on a flat piece of bark he had peeled from a birch log. "Building a fire," he said, and his voice was calm and flat and carried no particular emotion. Rivera almost laughed. "Sir, we can't get military-grade flares to light in this rain. You're not going to build a fire with some string." Arthur still didn't look up. He placed the dryer lint in the centre of the jute bird's nest, then began shredding the nylon bootlaces with a small folding knife, creating thin curls of material that he layered over the lint. "Nylon melts before it burns," he said quietly. "It catches a spark and holds it long enough to transfer to the tinder. The jute gives you flame. The lint gives you volume. You need all 3. Rivera opened his mouth to respond and then closed it because he didn't have anything useful to say. Tyler walked over. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" he asked, and his voice was different from Rivera's, not dismissive but uncertain. The voice of a young man who wanted to trust someone he loved but who had been trained to trust equipment and procedures. Arthur looked up at his grandson for a moment, and something passed between them that neither of them could have put into words. Something that bridged 50 years of silence and reached back to a frozen ridgeline on the other side of the world. "I've done this before," Arthur said. "Not like this. Worse than this." Tyler stared at his grandfather and nodded once and stepped back, and he said something to the rest of the squad that made them all stop what they were doing and watch. Arthur stood up and moved to a spot at the centre of the clearing where the helicopter would have the best line of sight. He gathered an armful of dead wood from the edge of the tree line, selecting pieces with a deliberateness that Rivera would later describe as surgical. He chose branches that had been sheltered under larger deadfalls, wood that was damp on the outside but still had dry heartwood. He arranged the wood in a configuration that none of the young soldiers recognized. A structure that was neither a teepee nor a log cabin nor any of the fire-building methods they had been taught in basic training. It was a platform build, the base layer set flat on the ground to elevate the fire above the waterlogged earth, with progressively smaller pieces stacked in a crisscross pattern that created channels for airflow while providing maximum surface area for the flames to climb. Then he took off his jacket. The jacket was an old field coat, olive drab, the kind of garment that tells you its owner has had it longer than most people have had their marriages. Arthur draped the jacket over the fire structure, creating a shelter that blocked the wind and rain from three sides while leaving the top partially exposed. He knelt in the mud in his shirt sleeves, the rain soaking through the flannel in seconds, and he placed his tinder bundle, the lint and jute and shredded nylon bootlace, at the base of the wood structure underneath the jacket's protection. Every soldier on that ridge was watching now. Haynes had stopped fiddling with the dead flares. Rivera had his arms crossed, but his mouth was shut. Dawson was leaning forward with something that looked like hope on his young face. Tyler stood with his hands in his pockets and his heart in his throat. Arthur pulled out the ferro rod. He positioned the rod against the tinder bundle, held the striker at the correct angle and scraped. The first strike threw a shower of white-hot sparks into the lint. The lint caught. A small orange glow appeared in the centre of the tinder bundle, no bigger than a dime, and Arthur cupped his hands around it and blew, gently, steadily, with the kind of measured breath control that suggested he had done this 1,000 times and understood that the difference between a fire and a failed attempt was the discipline of your lungs. The glow spread. The jute fibres caught. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the bundle, and Arthur kept blowing, feeding it oxygen, coaxing it, and then with a soft crackle that sounded louder than it had any right to in the middle of a rainstorm, a flame appeared, small, yellow, fragile. Arthur transferred the burning tinder bundle to the base of the wood structure with hands that were steady and sure, and the shredded nylon bootlaces melted and flared, and the flame climbed into the smallest kindling pieces and took hold. He fed it carefully. He knew exactly which pieces to add and when, never smothering the young flame with too much fuel, never starving it by waiting too long. The wood hissed and steamed as the outer moisture burned away, and the fire grew, and Arthur adjusted his jacket shelter to block a shift in the wind without ever taking his eyes off the flames. Within 5 minutes he had a fire the size of a basketball, burning with a steady, confident heat that pushed back against the rain and the cold with a defiance that seemed almost personal. Within 10 minutes the fire was a roaring blaze. 3 feet high, the flames bright enough to cast moving shadows across the faces of 6 soldiers, who stood watching in stunned silence. Arthur fed it more wood, bigger pieces now, and the fire consumed them and grew, and the rain fell into it and turned to steam, and the steam mixed with the smoke and rose in a thick, visible column that punched upward through the rain and the wind and the low cloud ceiling like a fist raised against the sky. Tyler grabbed the satellite communicator. "We have a ground signal," he said. "A fire. You should be able to see the smoke column." There was a pause on the other end, and then the pilot's voice came back, and even through the static Tyler could hear the surprise in it. "Roger that. We have a visual on your smoke. That is a significant fire. Beginning approach. Hold your position." The helicopter appeared out of the clouds 4 minutes later, its rotors beating the rain into horizontal sheets as it descended toward the ridge. The pilot brought it in at an angle, using Arthur's fire as his reference point, and set down in the clearing 50 meters from where the old man stood barefoot in the mud, with his jacket still draped over the fire structure, and his white hair plastered to his head, and his face lit by the orange glow of the blaze he had built with a bootlace and a handful of dryer lint. The extraction was quick and professional. The squad loaded into the helicopter with their gear, and Arthur was the last one to board. Tyler had to help him up because his hands were numb and his feet were bare and the step was high, but Arthur climbed in under his own power and sat down on the bench seat and said nothing. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Whitfield, who'd been flying medevac and extraction missions for 11 years, looked at Arthur and then looked at the fire that was still burning on the ridge below as the helicopter lifted off, and he shook his head slowly and keyed his intercom. "That fire technique," he said. "I've seen that in old manuals. Really old." Arthur looked at him. "Korean War era," Whitfield continued. "Arctic Survival Manual, 1953 edition. Bootlace cordage, layered natural and synthetic tinder. Platform build for wet ground. Wind shelter with personal clothing. They stopped teaching it 30 years ago when modern pyrotechnics was supposed to make field fire building obsolete." He paused and looked at Arthur with an expression that was equal parts professional respect and genuine wonder. "Where did you learn it?" he asked. Arthur was quiet for a long time. The helicopter banked through the rain, and the squad sat dripping and exhausted, and every one of them was looking at the old man who had just done what all their modern equipment could not. Arthur looked at his hands, turned them over, looked at the deep creases and the age spots and the swollen knuckles, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that everyone had to lean in to hear him over the rotors. "Chosin," he said. "Just the one word. The Chosin Reservoir." The crew chief's expression changed. Rivera, who had been sitting across from Arthur with his arms crossed and his ego battered, felt something cold run through him that had nothing to do with the rain, because even he knew what that word meant. Haynes looked at Tyler, and Tyler's face had gone very still, the face of a man learning something about his grandfather that he had always suspected but never confirmed. The Chosin Reservoir, the Korean War's most harrowing battle, November and December of 1950, temperatures dropping to 35 below zero. A United Nations force of roughly 30,000 men, most of them American Marines and Army soldiers, surrounded by over 120,000 Chinese troops in the frozen mountains of North Korea. A fighting retreat through ice and blood and death that lasted 17 days and became one of the most extraordinary survival stories in American military history. Arthur didn't elaborate. He never did. But the way the crew chief was looking at him had changed something in the helicopter, shifted the air the way a change in pressure shifts the weather, and Whitfield, who knew his military history the way some people know scripture, said quietly to Tyler that the men who survived Chosin were the ones who could build fire in conditions that should have made fire impossible, because fire meant life, and no fire meant death, and that the techniques Arthur had just used on that ridge weren't skills you learned from a manual, but skills you learned because the alternative was freezing to death in a ditch, while the enemy closed in around you. Tyler looked at his grandfather sitting there with bare feet and wet flannel, and that permanent expression on his face that he now understood wasn't stubbornness or sadness, but something else entirely. Something forged in a place so cold and so terrible that a rainstorm in Minnesota was barely worth mentioning. When the helicopter landed at Camp Ripley, word had already spread. The pilot had radioed ahead, and the base operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Jeffries, was waiting on the landing pad. He was there because a training exercise requiring emergency extraction generated paperwork, but also because the pilot had said something on the radio about a 79-year-old Chosin Reservoir veteran building a signal fire with bootlaces that outperformed every piece of modern signalling equipment the squad had been carrying. Jeffries was a career officer with 31 years of service, who had spent his professional life studying the intersection of traditional fieldcraft and modern military technology, and what he had just heard on the radio was, in his words, exactly the kind of thing that kept him up at night. The squad filed off the helicopter and lined up on the pad, and Jeffries walked straight past every one of them and stopped in front of Arthur, who was standing barefoot on the wet tarmac holding his unlaced boots in one hand. "Sir," Jeffries said, and the word carried a weight that made every young soldier on that pad stand a little straighter. "May I ask your name and unit?" "Arthur Beckett," Arthur said. "7th Infantry Division, 31st Regimental Combat Team." Jeffries took a slow breath. The 31st Regimental Combat Team. Task Force Faith. Anyone who knew the history of the Chosin Reservoir knew that name and what it meant. Task Force Faith had been positioned on the eastern shore of the reservoir when the Chinese struck, and they had absorbed some of the most ferocious attacks of the entire battle. The task force was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit, suffering over 90% casualties, and its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, was killed leading a breakout attempt, and later posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The men who survived Task Force Faith survived because they were tougher, luckier, and more resourceful than the conditions should have allowed, and they carried that survival with them for the rest of their lives like a second skeleton hidden beneath the first. Jeffries looked at Arthur for a long moment and then did something that made Tyler's eyes burn and Rivera's throat close, and Dawson actually take a step backward. He saluted. A full, crisp regulation salute delivered from a lieutenant colonel to a man in a soaking wet flannel shirt with no shoes on, standing on a helicopter pad in the rain. Arthur's right hand came up automatically, muscle memory overriding 50 years of civilian life, and he returned the salute with a precision that shocked every young soldier watching, because the old man's hand was steady and his posture had changed, subtly but unmistakably. The forward lean straightening into something that looked like the ghost of a soldier who had once stood at attention on frozen ground halfway around the world. Jeffries held the salute for 3 full seconds, then lowered his hand and said, "Mr. Beckett, on behalf of every soldier on this installation, I want to thank you for your service and for what you did today." Arthur lowered his hand and nodded once, and that was all, because Arthur Beckett had never needed words to say the things that mattered. What happened after that landing pad was not what anyone expected. Jeffries didn't just file his report and move on. He made phone calls. He contacted the Army Heritage Foundation. He contacted the Chosin Few, the Veterans Association for Chosin Reservoir Survivors, which at that point had fewer than 100 living members. He pulled Arthur's service record and confirmed what the old man had never told anyone in his family in specific terms. Arthur Beckett had been a private first class with Task Force Faith. He had been wounded twice during the Chinese assault, once by shrapnel and once by a rifle round that passed through his left shoulder. He had helped carry 3 wounded men during the breakout attempt across the frozen reservoir. He had been credited with building and maintaining warming fires under combat conditions that sustained his section through 2 nights when the temperature was so far below zero that exposed flesh froze in minutes. He had received the Bronze Star for Valor and the Purple Heart, and he had been discharged in 1951 and had never spoken publicly about any of it. Tyler sat with the report in his hands in Jeffries' office and cried. Not from sadness, but from a specific kind of grief that comes from understanding that someone you love has been carrying something enormous in silence for your entire life, and you never knew how to ask and they never knew how to tell. Karen, when Tyler called her, was quiet on the phone for a very long time, and then said that her father had woken up screaming twice a month for the first 20 years of her life, and that her mother had told her it was bad dreams and to go back to sleep, and that she had always known it was more than that. But her father's silence had been so complete and so absolute that she had learned to respect it even when it hurt her. Rivera sought out Arthur before the squad dispersed. The old man was sitting on a bench in the operations building, his boots relaced, a cup of coffee in his hands, looking exactly as he always looked. Quiet and unremarkable and easy to dismiss. Rivera stood in front of him and didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said something that cost him more than any physical effort he'd ever made. "I'm sorry, sir. I underestimated you and I was wrong." Arthur looked up at him and studied his face, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy something, because the corner of his mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You're young," Arthur said. "I was young once too. That's not a crime. It's an opportunity." Rivera nodded and walked away, and he would later tell his wife that the old man's grace in that moment taught him more about being a soldier than 6 years of active duty ever had. Haynes spent the following week researching the 1953 Arctic Survival Manual that Whitfield had referenced. He found a digitized copy in the Army's Technical Library archives and read it cover to cover. The section on emergency fire building in extreme wet conditions was almost a perfect description of what Arthur had done on the ridge, down to the specification of using boot cordage as a synthetic tinder accelerant and personal clothing as a wind and rain shelter for the initial flame. The manual had been written by a team of survival instructors who had interviewed Korean War veterans, including Chosin survivors, and compiled their field-tested techniques into a formal training document. It had been standard issue for cold weather units throughout the 1950s and 60s, before being gradually phased out in the 70s, as modern pyrotechnic and electronic signalling equipment was considered sufficient for any field condition. Haynes wrote a formal recommendation to his chain of command suggesting that elements of the manual be reintegrated into current survival training curricula, citing the squad's experience as evidence that modern equipment could fail in conditions where traditional techniques succeeded. The recommendation was reviewed, endorsed by Jeffries, and forwarded to the training command at Fort Drum with a cover letter that specifically mentioned Arthur Beckett by name. Dawson, the youngest soldier in the squad, asked Arthur one question before they parted ways. He asked him how he had stayed so calm when everything was going wrong on that ridge, when the flares were failing and the rain was getting worse and the helicopter couldn't find them. Arthur thought about it for a moment, and then he said something that Dawson would carry with him for the rest of his military career and eventually repeat at his own retirement ceremony 26 years later. "Panic is a luxury," Arthur said. "When you've been cold enough that your blood feels like it's turning to ice in your veins, and you've been scared enough that your hands shake so bad you can barely hold a match, you learn that panic doesn't warm you, and it doesn't light a fire, and it doesn't bring help. The only thing that helps is doing the next right thing, not the big thing, just the next thing. Find the tinder, shield the flame, feed the fire. That's all survival is, doing the next right thing, over and over, until someone finds you or the sun comes up." Dawson shook his hand and thanked him, and Arthur nodded and said, "Good luck, son," and meant it. The story might have ended there, as a memorable training incident and a family revelation, except that Jeffries was not the kind of officer who let things go. 3 months later, Arthur received a letter inviting him to Fort Drum, New York, to participate in a formal review of cold weather survival training methods. The letter was signed by a brigadier general. Arthur's first instinct was to decline, because his first instinct was always to decline anything that put him in front of people and asked him to talk about things he had spent a lifetime not talking about. But Tyler drove up from Camp Ripley on a Saturday morning and sat with his grandfather on the bench outside the Elks Lodge and said something that Arthur hadn't heard before. He said he was proud of him, not for what he'd done on the ridge, although that too, but for surviving what he'd survived and for being the man he was despite carrying something so heavy for so long. And Arthur, who had not cried since 1950, felt his eyes sting and looked away and said he'd think about it, which Tyler knew meant yes. Arthur went to Fort Drum in January. He stood in front of a classroom of young soldiers, most of them the age he'd been when his world was frozen and burning at the same time, and he demonstrated the fire-building technique he had learned on the eastern shore of the Chaussin Reservoir 74 years earlier. He didn't talk about the battle. He didn't talk about the friends he had lost or the sounds he still heard at night or the cold that had never fully left his bones. He talked about tinder. He talked about airflow. He talked about the physics of flame and the discipline of breath, and the importance of preparing your materials before you need them, because when your hands are shaking and the world is falling apart around you, the only thing that saves you is preparation meeting calm. The soldiers listened with a silence that was different from the silence on the helicopter. Not stunned or guilty, but attentive. The silence of people who recognized they were in the presence of something they couldn't learn from a manual or a screen. After the demonstration, the brigadier general who had signed the invitation letter shook Arthur's hand and thanked him, and then did something that made the entire room go still. He presented Arthur with a commander's coin, a personal challenge coin that senior officers carry and present to individuals who demonstrate exceptional excellence. It was a small thing, a metal disc that fit in the palm of a hand, but in the military culture it carried a significance that everyone in that room understood, and when the general placed it in Arthur's hand, the old man looked at it for a long moment, and then put it in his shirt pocket and said, "Thank you, General," and that was enough. The room erupted in applause, and Arthur stood there in his flannel shirt and his orthopedic boots, and accepted it with the same quiet dignity he had brought to everything else in his life. Tyler drove his grandfather home from the airport after the Fort Drum trip, and they rode in silence for most of the drive. Comfortable silence, the kind that exists between two people who understand each other better than they used to. About 20 miles outside of Brainerd, Arthur said something unprompted, which was rare enough to make Tyler glance over. He said that on the worst night at Chaussin, the night his section thought they were all going to die, he had built a fire in a foxhole using strips torn from his own boot leather and dry grass he had collected during a lull in the fighting, and carried inside his shirt against his body to keep it dry. He said that fire had lasted 4 hours and kept 5 men alive, and that he had never told anyone because he didn't think it mattered compared to what the men around him had done and suffered and lost. He said he understood now, after the ridge and the helicopter and Fort Drum, that maybe it did matter, not because he was special, but because the fire was special, because the thing that saved them was knowledge passed from one soldier to another across decades and continents, and that passing it forward was the only way to make sure it wasn't lost. Tyler drove and listened and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been less than what his grandfather's words deserved. Arthur Beckett went back to his bench outside the Elks Lodge. He went back to his thermos of black coffee and his worn paperback westerns, and his daily routine that looked from the outside like the quiet end of an unremarkable life. But some things had changed. The cigar box with the purple heart and the bronze star was no longer in the closet. It was on the mantel in the living room, next to the commander's coin, and a framed photo of a young man in a winter uniform standing in snow that went up to his knees with an expression on his face that was impossible to read unless you knew what you were looking at. Karen visited more often, and sometimes they sat together and she asked careful questions and he gave careful answers, and the space between them, which had been filled for 50 years with silence and love and the things he couldn't say, began to fill with something else, something that felt like understanding. Tyler's squad never looked at an old man the same way again. Rivera specifically made it a personal practice to seek out veterans at every community event he attended and shake their hands and ask them about their service, not with the reflexive thank you for your service that had become so automatic it was almost meaningless, but with genuine questions and genuine attention, because he had learned on a rainy ridge in Minnesota that the quietest people in the room were often carrying the heaviest loads. The 1953 Arctic Survival Manual is being reviewed for reintegration into modern training curricula. A section on field fire building under extreme wet conditions has been flagged for particular emphasis, and the review document cites the Chippewa National Forest incident as a case study in the continuing relevance of traditional survival techniques. In the margins of the digitized manual, someone, it's unclear who, has written a note in pencil that reads, "Beckett technique, viable, recommend retention." It is a small note in the margin of an old document that most people will never read, and it is exactly the kind of legacy Arthur Beckett would have wanted. Not a monument or a ceremony or a headline, but a piece of knowledge preserved, a flame passed forward, a signal fire that would burn long after the man who lit it was gone. The rain stopped the next morning. It always does. But what Arthur Beckett built on that ridge, and what he built in that foxhole 74 years before, and what he built in a classroom at Fort Drum, and what he built in the silence between himself and his grandson on a long drive home through Minnesota, those fires are still burning. Not the flames themselves, because flames are temporary, but the knowledge that made them possible, and the will that struck the spark and the understanding that the oldest solutions are sometimes the only ones that work when everything modern fails. That is the kind of fire that doesn't go out. If you believe that the generation that came before us still has something to teach, if you believe that respect isn't something that should depend on what a person looks like or how old they are, or how quietly they carry their burdens, then subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of people who refused to be forgotten, who proved their worth when it mattered most, and who reminded us that honor doesn't have an expiration date. Subscribe, and the next time someone underestimates the quiet person in the room, you'll remember Arthur Beckett, barefoot in the rain, lighting a fire that 6 soldiers with $1,000 worth of modern equipment could not.